The ship fell out of a clear sky on a Tuesday, no warning, no signal, no burning trail of light to mark its coming. Just a sound like God snapping a bone. And then the ground shook, and then 60,000 tons of alien metal was sitting in the middle of the Kazakhstan steppe, half buried in black scorched earth, still breathing smoke into a sky that had no idea what to do with it. 3 villages felt the tremor. One shepherd watched his entire flock bolt south and never come back. A weather satellite caught the impact on the edge of its sensor range and flagged it as a meteor. The flag sat in a queue for 11 minutes before a board analyst in Almaty pulled it up, looked at the thermal image, and called his supervisor. His supervisor called her supervisor. 48 hours later, a military cordon stretched for 12 kilometers in every direction, and Dr. Sarah Chen was standing at the outer edge of it, arguing with a man who had more medals on his chest than she had years of education. "I am a xenobiologist," she said. "I study things that are not from this planet." That, she pointed past him at the black shape in the distance, the one that was clearly, obviously, not a rock, is a thing that is not from this planet. So please move. Colonel Marcus Webb looked at her the way men like him looked at problems they had not anticipated, like she was a weather system. Annoying, temporary. "The site is not cleared," he said. Cleared for what? He had no answer for that. Nobody did. She got through 3 days later, when enough generals had argued with enough scientists, and enough scientists had won, that the cordon pulled back to 6 kilometers and a small joint team was allowed in on foot, with equipment they had to carry themselves. There were 7 of them. Chen, 2 physicists named Okafor and Brandt, a materials engineer called Yusuf who hadn't slept in 4 days and looked like it, a linguist named Mirova, who kept very quiet and watched everything, and 2 military escorts who had been told not to touch anything and looked deeply unhappy about being here. They walked toward the ship. It was not beautiful. That was the first thing Chen noted. She had imagined, her whole career, what first contact would look like. She had imagined sleek curves, strange lights. Something that felt built with intention. Something that felt proud. This was none of those things. The ship was massive, yes. Maybe 400 meters long, wider at the back than the front, shaped vaguely like a crescent that had been crushed and repaired badly, and then crushed again. The hull was dark gray and pocked with damage that was clearly old. Not from the landing, but from before. From whatever life this ship had lived before it ended up here. There were panels hanging loose. Sections where the hull had been welded shut from the outside, with materials that didn't match the rest of the structure. Places where whole chunks of the outer shell were just gone, exposing interior frameworks that had no business being exposed. Brandt said what everyone was thinking. "It looks like they threw it away." Nobody laughed. Because it did. It looked exactly like that. Like something taken to the edge of town and left at the curb. They walked around the full perimeter that first day. They took readings. They took photographs. They did not try to enter. Chen made notes in her recorder and tried to describe what she was seeing without letting her hands shake. She didn't fully succeed. The ship had no windows, no visible propulsion ports on the exterior, no markings that looked like a language, at least not one Mirova recognized. And Mirova had spent 20 years studying every writing system human beings had ever produced. What markings there were looked almost mechanical, like part numbers, like inventory codes. "Not a warship," Okafor said, late in the afternoon, sitting on a folding stool with his tablet on his knee. "The hull configuration doesn't support weapons arrays. No obvious firing platforms, no hardpoints, no targeting systems anywhere on the exterior. A cargo ship," Chen said. "Maybe, or a transport, or a research vessel," he paused. "Or a garbage hauler." That word sat in the air between them. Garbage. Chen looked at the ship again, at the mismatched welds, the missing hull sections, the damage that was clearly, unambiguously old. She thought. Someone decided this thing was not worth keeping. She thought. They were wrong. The entry point was found on day 6, not a door exactly. More like a seam in the hull that had been pressed shut from the inside, and then never opened again. Yusuf spent 2 days studying the seam's edge with instruments and his bare hands before he concluded it was designed to be opened, that the mechanism was internal, but had a manual override somewhere along the exterior lip. He found the override by accident. He leaned against Prohut, and part of it moved under his shoulder. The hiss of pressure equalizing was the loudest sound Chen had ever heard. The door, and it was a door, it swung outward on a hinge system that moved like it had been used 10,000 times. Opened onto a corridor that was dark and cold, and smelled like nothing. Not stale air, not chemicals, nothing. Like the air inside had simply stopped being air at some point, and was now just molecules waiting for a purpose. They stood at the threshold. The 2 military escorts had their weapons up. The scientists had their instruments up. Mirova had a notebook. Chen stepped in first. The floor was solid under her boots. The walls were a dark metal she could not identify. Not the same as the hull exterior. something smoother, something that seemed to absorb her flashlight rather than reflect it. The corridor ran straight for about 30 meters and then bent left. The ceiling was low enough that Okafor, who was tall, had to angle his head slightly. Built for beings roughly human-sized. That was either a coincidence or something much more interesting. They walked the corridor. They found more corridors. They found rooms, sealed, most of them, some of them clearly storage, some of them clearly functional in some way they couldn't yet parse. They found what appeared to be a central chamber, large and oval, with a raised platform in the middle and surfaces along the walls that were covered in the same inventory code markings from the exterior. They found in a side room off the central chamber 3 dead aliens. They were small. That was the first thing. Chen had expected large. She didn't know why, perhaps because the ship was large. But these creatures were small, not quite a meter tall, with 4 limbs and a bilateral symmetry that was almost familiar, except for all the ways it wasn't. They had been dead for a long time, long enough that what remained was close to mummification. The environment of the sealed ship had preserved them past the point of rot. They were still wearing something that resembled suits, close-fitting, dark blue, with the same inventory code markings on the sleeves. They had not died violently. That was the second thing Chen noted. They were positioned, 2 of them near the room's far wall and 1 near the door, in postures that looked like rest, like they had simply stopped, like the ship had stopped and taken them with it. Morova was very quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Workers, look at the markings. These aren't military insignia. These aren't rank. These are job classifications." Nobody asked how she knew that. They trusted Morova. "Workers who were on a ship that someone decided to throw away," Okafor said slowly. "And they couldn't get out," Yusuf said. The room was cold and still. One of the military escorts, a young man named Torres, who had been pointedly not showing any reaction to any of this for 6 days, made a sound in his throat that was almost a word. Chen looked at him. His face was doing something complicated. She understood it. She was doing the same thing with her face. Someone had dumped this ship, with the workers still in it. She filed that away in the part of her mind that was not science, the part that was something older and less tidy. She filed it, and she kept moving, because there was work to do, and the work was more important right now than the feeling, and she was very good at that particular trade-off. The full report reached 14 governments simultaneously on day 19. The reaction was predictable in structure, if not in detail. There was panic. There was overreach. There were emergency sessions and military buildups, and 3 different countries quietly began repositioning satellites before anyone asked them to stop. There was a week where Chen genuinely thought someone was going to do something irreversible, and she spent most of that week on phone calls with people who had much more power than her and much less information. But the ship sat in its crater and did nothing. It had no power. It had no active systems. It was, by every measure they had, dead. And after the panic had a chance to breathe, curiosity began to win. It always does, with humans. That is the thing about them. Panic is loud and it takes up a lot of room, but it has a short attention span. Curiosity is quiet and it is patient and it does not give up. The Joint Scientific Commission was formally established 6 weeks after the landing. 43 scientists from 11 countries. Chen was on it, Yusuf was on it, Okafor, Brandt, Morova, all of them, and dozens of others. Engineers, physicists, biologists, chemists, linguists, computer scientists. People who had spent their entire careers waiting for exactly this, and who now had it and were not going to waste a single day. They moved into the ship, not just visits, they moved in. They built a pressurized attachment at the entry point, a temporary structure that let them pass between the ship and the outside without equalizing pressure every time. They set up workstations in the central chamber. They cataloged every room, every surface, every object they found. There were hundreds of objects. Most of them made no sense yet. That was fine, that was the job. That was what scientists were for, sitting with things that made no sense and refusing to leave until they did. Yusuf found the power core on day 41. It was in the lowest section of the ship, a chamber that took 3 days to reach because half the access corridors were collapsed or sealed. The core itself was a sphere about 2 meters in diameter, made of a material that Yusuf's instruments categorized, embarrassingly, as unknown class 4, recheck equipment. He rechecked the equipment 4 times. Same answer. The core was not dead. That was the thing. Every other system in the ship was dead, but the core was not. It was running at what appeared to be a very low level, a pilot light, Yusuf said, keeping itself alive. Waiting for what? Chen asked. Yusuf looked at the sphere for a long time. Use, he said. Maybe. She didn't ask him to explain that. She wrote it in her notes and let it sit. The first breakthrough came from Morova, which surprised no one who knew her. She had spent 2 months with the markings. Not just the inventory codes. Those she had decoded relatively early. They were indeed job classifications and item categories and numerical systems that mapped onto base 12 counting, which itself told them something important. She had spent 2 months with the deeper markings, the ones in the central chamber, the ones that covered the raised platform completely and ran along the walls in patterns that were clearly not inventory and clearly not decorative. She came to Chen's workstation on a Wednesday morning and put a single sheet of printed notes on the desk. "It's a manual," she said. Chen looked up. The markings on the platform, their instructions. Step-by-step operational instructions for someone who does not know how to operate the ship. Morova sat down across from her, and for the first time in 2 months, she looked like she had slept. They left a manual, on the platform, in the most central, most visible location in the ship, right where anyone who entered would see it. Chen stared at her. "They knew," she said. Morova nodded. Someone knew this ship was being dumped. Someone knew it might be found. And someone wrote instructions for whoever found it. She paused. "In a writing system designed to be decoded. The structure is pedagogical. It teaches you how to read it as you read it. I've been decoding it for 2 months, and I didn't realize until this morning that the early sections were teaching me the language I needed to read the later sections." Chen sat back in her chair. Outside, through the pressurized attachment, through the hull of the ship, somewhere above them, the stars were doing what they always did. Sitting there, not caring, but someone out there had cared. Someone had left a message, had hidden a key inside the lock for whoever came after. She thought about the 3 dead workers in the side room. She thought about the mismatched welds and the missing hull sections, and the ship that someone had decided was not worth keeping. She thought they threw it away. But someone inside it, before it fell, left them a road. She picked up the notes. "All right," she said. "Let's learn to read." The manual had 43 sections. Morova worked through them in order, the way the manual itself seemed to demand. Each section built on the last, each set of symbols, unlocking the next layer of meaning the way a key unlocks a door that contains another key. She worked with 2 linguists she trusted, a mathematician named Patel who understood structural patterns better than anyone Chen had ever met, and a pot of tea that she refilled so many times the kettle in the workstation corner gave out and had to be replaced. By section 9 she could read simple operational commands. By section 17 she understood the ship's internal map. By section 26 she was reading technical specifications that Yusuf stood over her shoulder to see. And Yusuf did not stand over anyone's shoulder for anything, so that told Chen something. "It's not just a manual for the ship," Morova said one evening, 3 months into the work. The central chamber was quiet around them. Most of the team had gone to the sleeping quarters in the pressurized attachment. The ship's walls absorbed sound the same way they absorbed light, completely. So the quiet was total, the kind of quiet that sits on your chest. "What is it then?" Chen asked. Morova set down her pen. She had gone back to pen and paper weeks ago. Said it helped her think in shapes instead of words. "It's a letter," she said. "The technical instructions are real, they work, but they're the frame. The content, the actual content, is a letter. From someone inside this ship, written before it was dumped. Written to whoever came after." Chen waited. The writer knew the ship was condemned. They disagreed with the decision. They thought the ship had value that the people condemning it couldn't see or didn't want to see. Morova picked up her pen again, turned it in her fingers. They called them, the ones who dumped it, the Veth. And the writer used a word for the Veth that I've been translating as the ones who decide weight. Like. The ones who decide what is worth carrying. And they decided this ship wasn't. They decide everything isn't eventually. Morova looked at the walls, the markings running floor to ceiling, the inventory codes, and the deeper language beneath them. The writer called the ship the Unbroken. Not its official designation, that was a number. Unbroken was what the crew called it, what the workers called it. The 3 dead workers in the side room. Chen had thought about them every day for 3 months. "The writer was one of them," she said. It wasn't a question. Morova nodded, a maintenance engineer, lower crew. Someone who kept the ship running and was not consulted when the ship was written off. She paused. The Veth considered the core drive irreparable. The writer disagreed. They believed the core could be restarted with the right sequence and the right materials, and they spent the last section of the manual explaining exactly how to do it. Chen stood up. "Show Yusuf." Yusuf read the translation 3 times, standing up, not moving, with the expression of a man who has just been told something he has wanted to hear his whole life, and is not sure yet if he should trust it. Then he went to the core chamber and did not come out for 18 hours. When he emerged, he was wearing the same clothes, and his eyes had that specific unfocused look that meant he had been thinking so hard he had temporarily stopped experiencing his own body. He sat down across from Chen in the central chamber and put his hands flat on the table. "The core isn't broken," he said. "The Veth said it was. The Veth were wrong. He said it simply, with no drama, the way you say something that is just true. The core went into a protection state. Something happened. I think a cascade failure in the secondary systems, maybe 100 years ago, maybe more. And the core locked itself down to prevent full collapse. It's been sitting in that locked state ever since. The Veth ran diagnostics, saw a lockdown core and called it dead, and it's not. It's completely intact. It's been waiting. He looked at her. The restart sequence in the manual. I cross-referenced it with the physical components I've been cataloging for 3 months. Every component the writer mentioned exists. Some of them need to be reconnected. Some of the secondary systems need to be rebuilt, and I can build them because I now understand what they do. He stopped. Sarah, I can restart this ship's core drive. The quiet of the chamber sat around them. How long, she said. A year. Maybe less if I have the right people. She thought about 14 governments and the arguments that had been running for 4 months over who controlled this project, who had access, who got the data. She thought about the 3 dead workers. You'll have the right people, she said. She was wrong about one thing. It took 8 months. Not because Yusuf was slow, because the world kept interrupting. 4 months in, 2 governments withdrew from the Joint Commission over a dispute about data sharing agreements that had nothing to do with the ship and everything to do with older arguments that had been looking for a new arena. Chen spent 3 weeks doing nothing but phone calls, pulling strings she hadn't known she had, trading favors with people she didn't particularly like. She got them back, barely. Chopst, 2 months after that, a private security contractor, hired by a technology company whose name Chen was not supposed to know but knew anyway, got through the outer cordon at 3 in the morning with cutting equipment and the goal of taking physical samples from the hull. They got as far as the entry point before military response reached them. Nobody was hurt. The contractor's employer issued a statement calling it a research initiative. Chen issued a statement calling it something else entirely, and was asked by 3 separate governments to tone it down. She toned it down to a 4 instead of a 9. That was the best she could do. Through all of it, the core team worked. Yusuf in the depths of the ship, rebuilding secondary systems with components machined to specifications derived from Mirova's translations. Okafor and Brandt mapping the power flow architecture, tracing conduits through the ship's body the way surgeons trace veins. Patel running calculations that filled entire wall panels in the pressurized attachment, numbers and symbols that the military escorts had stopped pretending to ignore. Torres, the young soldier who had made the complicated sound in the room with the dead workers, had quietly requested a reassignment to the commission's security detail rather than a rotation out. He spent his off hours watching Okafor work and asking careful questions. Okafor, who had no patience for people who wasted his time, had started answering them. Chen noticed these things. She filed them. On the morning of the restart, the central chamber held 31 people. Yusuf had wanted to run it with just the core team. Chiz had overruled him, gently, because this was not something that belonged only to the people who had done the work. It belonged to everyone who had come this far. Every argument, every sleepless night, every hour of bureaucratic combat. It was all pointing at this moment, and the people who had lived those hours deserved to be in the room. The sequence was 14 steps. Mirova had translated it 6 times to be sure. Yusuf had rehearsed it twice on the physical components without completing the final activation step. Just to confirm his hands knew the path. He began. Steps 1 through 8 were quiet. Physical reconnections, conduit alignments, the setting of parameters on panels that had been dark for longer than humanity had been building cities. The ship did not react. It sat and waited the way it had always waited. Step 9 was the first power injection into the secondary network. The lights came on. Not the harsh white lights the team had strung through the ship themselves. Something else. A low blue-tinted illumination that rose from the walls themselves, from channels in the dark metal that nobody had identified because they had never been lit. The entire ship breathed light, slowly, evenly, like something waking from a very long sleep. Nobody spoke. Step 10, 11, 12. The sound came at step 13. A low vibration felt in the feet before it was heard by the ears, rising from somewhere far below them. From the core chamber, a sound like a vast slow heartbeat finding its rhythm. Step 14. Yusuf pressed his palm flat against the activation panel. The heartbeat deepened. The lights brightened by 10% and held. Every display surface in the central chamber, surfaces they had cataloged as display surfaces for months without being able to use them, came alive at once, filling with data in the Veth script in the inventory language, in the deeper language of the manual. The ship was awake. The room erupted. Not the way rooms erupt in films. It was not neat or triumphant. It was messy and loud, and someone was crying, and someone else was laughing. And Okafor sat down on the floor because his legs decided they were done. Brandt grabbed Patel by the shoulders and shook him. Torres stood at the edge of the room with his arms crossed, and his jaw tight, and his eyes doing what eyes do when a person refuses to let them show what is actually happening. Chen stood still in the middle of it. She was reading the displays. The data that poured through the ship's active systems in the first 12 hours was more than the team could process in a year. They recorded everything. They began sorting. They built a priority hierarchy. Navigation systems first, propulsion second, life support third, communications fourth. It was in the communications archive that Chen found the context she hadn't known she was missing. The ship had received transmissions, hundreds of them, spanning what appeared to be a significant period before the ship was dumped. The transmissions were from Veth administrative systems, the Veth equivalent of official channels, of government correspondence, of corporate communication. Morova worked through them with Patel for 6 days, and came to Chen with a summary that Chen read standing up in the corridor outside the central chamber at 2 in the morning. The Veth were old, extraordinarily old as a civilization. The scale of the timeline in the records suggested tens of thousands of years of organized spacefaring. They were large, not in physical size but in reach. Hundreds of systems, thousands of worlds, a network of trade and administration that made every human government look like a neighborhood association. And they were by any useful measure done, not dying, not at war, just finished. The records showed a civilization that had stopped moving forward so long ago that it had forgotten forward was a direction. The Vethden's administrative systems were dedicated almost entirely to maintenance, maintaining what existed, maintaining the order of things as they were. Any system that was not performing at its designated function was classified, processed, and removed. Ships that needed too much repair, worlds that were not producing at target levels, technologies that had been superseded. The Unbroken had needed too much repair, so it had been classified, processed, removed, dropped on an uninhabited, by Veth standards, backwater world in a system nobody visited. Chen set down the summary. She thought, they're so big and so old that they throw away ships the size of skyscrapers. They throw away ships the way she threw away a pen that had run dry. No anger, no waste. Just reclassification, she thought. They do not know we are here. Or if they know, they don't care. We are below the level at which they take notice. She thought about what Morova had said. The ones who decide wait. Then she went and found Yusuf. He was in the propulsion analysis room, which was what they had started calling the large room aft of the central chamber, where the drive system schematics were displayed. He was standing in front of a wall of data with his hands in his pockets, which meant he had been standing there long enough that he had given up on doing anything and was just looking. The drive, she said. When can we understand it? He didn't turn around. I understand it now. Enough. Enough for what? Enough to know it works on principles we've never touched. Enough to know it could get this ship off the ground. Enough to know it would take us. He stopped. He turned around. His face was the face of a man standing at the edge of something enormous, looking down without fear. Anywhere, Sarah. It could take us anywhere. She looked at him. Then that, she said, is what we are going to learn to do. The report she sent to the commission that night was 3 pages long and classified at the highest level available. The cover page said, in plain language, what they had found and what it meant. It said, this ship is not a curiosity. It is not a museum piece. It is not a diplomatic asset. It is a blueprint. It said, the civilization that threw this away is enormous and ancient and believes we are nothing. They made a decision about what had weight and what did not, and they were wrong about this ship, and they are wrong about us. It said, we have a choice now. We can guard this thing and argue about it for the next 50 years. Or we can learn it, build from it, rise. The last line was not scientific language. Chen knew that. She included it anyway. It said, they looked at this ship and saw a failed thing. We looked at it and saw a road. Let's find out who was right. 7 years is a long time to build something. It is also, by the measure of what humanity was trying to build, almost impossibly short. The facility went up in the Kazakh steppe 4 kilometers from the Unbroken's crater. Not a lab, not a research station, a shipyard. The largest construction project in human history, which was a sentence that people kept saying out loud because it didn't feel real until you heard it spoken. 43 nations contributed resources. 16 of them contributed engineering teams. 6 of them contributed manufacturing capacity that had never been pointed at anything except military hardware, and now was pointed at something else entirely. The arguments did not stop. They never stopped. They were just managed. The way you manage a fire that you need for warmth and cannot afford to let go out and cannot afford to let grow. Chen spent 2 of those 7 years doing almost nothing except managing the fire. She got gray at the temples. She stopped noticing. The Unbroken stayed in its crater. It had become the world's most studied object by a margin so large the second-place object, a meteorite in a Moscow museum, was almost an insult by comparison. Every system was mapped. Every component was cataloged and understood, and in most cases, replicated. Yusuf's team reverse-engineered the alloys by working backward from the properties. They didn't need to know the process, just the result, and with enough analysis and enough failed attempts, they found processes of their own that got to the same place. The drive was the hardest. The Unbroken's core drive did not work on any principle that had a name in human physics before the ship arrived. It worked on principles that had to be understood before they could be named, and had to be named before they could be taught, and had to be taught before they could be applied. Okafor spent 18 months developing a new branch of mathematics just to describe what the drive was doing. He published it. It was the most cited paper in the history of scientific publishing within a year. He did not care about the citations. He cared that the equations were right. They were right. The drive on humanity's first ship, the one being assembled in the shipyard, hull plates going up week by week, a skeleton of familiar steel over a heart of entirely new principles, worked. It worked on paper, it worked in simulation. It worked in the subscale test platform they built in year 4, a drive the size of a large room that they fired for 8 seconds in a test chamber, and then spent 3 months analyzing the data from, because 8 seconds had been enough to confirm everything, and also to produce 7 new questions for everyone it answered. Torres was there for the subscale test. He had been part of the Commission's security and operations team for 6 years by then, and had quietly, without announcement, become something else. He was not a soldier playing a secondary role anymore. He understood the systems well enough to brief visiting officials when the scientists were too busy, which was always. He had read every translation Mirova had produced. He had sat with Okafor's mathematics until they made sense to him, which had taken 8 months and a level of stubborn refusal to quit that Okafor had publicly called at a team dinner the most impressive non-scientific thing he had ever witnessed. When the subscale drive fired and held for its 8 seconds, and the test chamber shook, and every instrument in the room spiked and then settled, Torres stood with his arms crossed and did not smile, but his breathing changed. Chen was standing next to him and she heard it. She understood it. She was doing the same thing with her lungs. The ship was named in year 6, before it was finished, because waiting felt wrong. There were proposals, hundreds of them, submitted through the Commission's public portal, from people all over the world, who wanted to be part of naming the thing. Most of them were fine, dignified, historic, the names of scientists, of explorers, of concepts, Unity, Pioneer, First Light. Chen read them all. She sat with them for a week. Then she went to Mirova. What was the word, she said, that the writer used for the ship? The maintenance engineer, in the manual. Mirova looked at her. You know what it was, she said. Chen knew what it was. The ship was named the Unbroken. Not because the alien ship had been named that. The alien ship still sat in its crater and had its own history. The human ship was named Unbroken because of what the word meant in context, because of who had used it and why. A worker who had been left behind, on a ship being discarded by people who had decided it had no more value, had given it a name that was an argument, an act of defiance against the ones who decided wait. It seemed right to carry that argument forward. Launch day was a Thursday in March, 8 years and 4 months after the original ship fell from the sky. It was not broadcast live. That decision had been argued over for a year, and the final call was Chen's. If something went wrong, the last thing humanity needed was to watch it happen in real time on a global feed. There would be data. There would be a full record. If it went right, they could show that record to everyone on Earth. If it went wrong, they would need time to think before they talked. The crew was 12 people. Chen was one of them, a decision that every government on the Commission had objected to. And she had simply not responded to the objections, because they were her objections to dismiss. Yusuf was the chief engineer. Mirova was aboard because if they encountered anyone, language would matter. Torres was the operations lead, which was a title invented for him because the old titles did not fit what he had become. The first test was not a jump. It was an orbital run, lifting off under conventional thrust, reaching low orbit, running the drive at low power to maintain position, then returning. Basic. Careful. The kind of test you do when what you have built has never existed before, and you are not reckless, only determined. The Unbroken lifted on the first attempt. It lifted clean, the way a thing lifts when it was built correctly, when every component earned its place. When 7 years of arguments and failures and rebuilds and sleepless nights all pointed at one moment, and that moment delivered. The thrust was smooth, the ascent was smooth. Torres called out systems as they cleared atmosphere, and every call was nominal. And Chen sat in the navigator's seat and watched Earth curve away below them, and did not let herself feel it yet, because there was still work to do. Orbit was nominal, drive test was nominal, re-entry was nominal. They landed in the steppe 4 kilometers from where the original Unbroken still sat in its crater, and the ground crew ran to meet them, and Chen stepped out of the ship, and the cold March air hit her face, and she let herself feel it then. She felt it for about 30 seconds. Then she went to debrief. The first jump came 11 months later, short, targeted. A destination inside their own solar system. A point in the outer belt. Chosen because it was empty and the round trip could be completed in a time frame that wouldn't break anyone's nerve. The jump itself lasted, by every clock on the ship, 4 seconds. The distance covered was 4.2 billion kilometers. Chen had read the theoretical explanations for jump travel so many times she could have written them. She had run the simulations. She had helped design the targeting system. She knew intellectually completely that what the drive did was not magic but physics. New physics. Physics without a name 10 years ago, but physics. It did not feel like physics. It felt like the universe blinked and opened its eye somewhere else. 4 seconds. Then the outer belt around them. The distant smear of the sun smaller and colder at this range. The stars unchanged because stars are never changed by what small things do near them. The ship's communications were quiet for almost 30 seconds after emergence. Then Torres said very calmly, "Jump complete. Coordinates confirmed. All systems nominal." And Yusuf from the engineering station said one word. Again, they went again, farther each time. Tested the limits they had calculated, and found the calculations were right, which was its own kind of extraordinary, because they had derived them from alien mathematics that had been decoded from a dead maintenance worker's letter. The third jump took them beyond the solar system. The fourth jump took them to a star system 31 light-years from Earth that Okafor had flagged as interesting based on spectral data. A yellow star with planets in stable orbits, and the kind of atmospheric signatures that meant, if you were paying attention, that something was happening there that wasn't just geology. They dropped out of jump in the outer edge of the system and ran passive scans. Yusuf saw it first. "Ship," he said. "Bearing 274, range approximately 40 million kilometers, one ship. Holding position near the system's second planet. Not moving toward them. Not moving away." The configuration was nothing like the Unbroken. It was sleeker, lighter, built with different priorities. The hull was a pale copper color that caught the star's light and held it. Chen said Morova. Morova was already at her station, already recording. "Passive scan only from them so far. They see us. There's no way they don't see us. But they're not broadcasting yet. They're waiting. For what? To see what we do." Chen thought about that. She thought about what they looked like from the outside. A ship that didn't match any known configuration, emerging from a jump at the edge of someone else's system, sitting still and watching. "Broadcast the standard greeting package," she said. "Mathematical sequence first, then the language bridge Morova built." It had taken Morova 4 years to build the language bridge, a first contact communication protocol derived partly from the Veth writing system, and partly from first principles about how any intelligence that had developed mathematics would understand certain universal patterns. It was the most careful piece of work Chen had ever seen anyone do. They broadcast it. For 11 minutes, nothing. Then the copper ship responded. It took Morova 6 hours to establish basic communication. Not conversation, not yet. Basic communication. The equivalent of yes, no, we hear you, we mean no harm. We have heard that kind of thing before, and note you are flying a drive configuration we associate with a very specific and very powerful civilization. Please explain. That last part took 3 hours alone because the concept of "please explain" was embedded in a grammatical structure that implied a hierarchical request. Not a question between equals, but something a lower party asked of a higher one. Morova unpacked it carefully and answered in kind, using the same register, meaning, "We understand you think we are beneath you. We are answering anyway." The copper ship's people were called, in their own language, the Orath. They were old, not Veth old, but old by any human measure. They had been traveling the stars for 4,000 years. They knew the Veth the way a small town knows the highway that runs past it but never stops. Aware of the presence, careful around the edges, never quite in the way. What they did not know, what became clear across the slow, careful hours of Morova's work, was that anyone was living on the third planet of the system the Veth had used as a dumping ground 17 years ago. The Orath representative, when Morova finally got enough common language built to ask direct questions, asked one of its own. The translation was rough. Morova flagged it as approximate, but the meaning was plain enough. The Orath wanted to know, where had this ship come from? Morova translated the question for Chen. Chen looked at her for a moment, then she said, "Tell them we built it. Tell them we built it from the one the Veth threw away." Morova translated. The response from the Orath took 4 minutes. 4 minutes was a long time at this stage of the exchange, when most responses had come in under 30 seconds. When it came, Morova read it twice before she spoke. They want to know, she said slowly, if we are the species from the third planet. Yes, Chen said. Another long pause from the copper ship. Then the response came, and Morova translated it, and the translation was 3 words. That is not possible. Chen looked at the copper ship on the display screen, small against the stars, old and careful and absolutely certain of what it knew about the universe. She thought about a maintenance engineer on a condemned ship, writing a letter to no one, believing someone would come. She thought about Yusuf standing in front of a dead core and calling it alive. She thought about 7 years of arguments and steel, and new mathematics, and a ship named after a word that was an argument. Tell them, she said, that we understand why they think that, and tell them we're here anyway. The Orith did not respond for 2 hours. When they did, the message was longer, more careful. Morova spent an hour with it and came back to Chen, with something that was not a translation of the words, but a translation of the feeling behind them, which was the more important thing. The Orith were afraid, not of the humans specifically, not yet. They were afraid of what it meant. Because if a species no one had been watching, on a world the Veth had used as a waste site, had taken Veth technology, and learned it, and built a working drive and come 31 light years to someone else's system in a ship they had named themselves. Then something had changed in the galaxy that the Orath's 4,000 years of careful navigation had not prepared them for. Something new was moving, and it had not asked anyone's permission. Chen received the summary from Morova and read it standing up, the way she read things that mattered. Then she asked for a full system scan of the Orith's world. She asked Okafor for an estimate on their technological level. She asked Torres for a security assessment of their current position. She did all the things a responsible person does when they are somewhere new and do not yet know all the rules. Then she sat down and thought about the Veth, about their thousands of worlds and their ancient administrative systems, and their habit of deciding what had weight and what did not. They had decided Earth did not. They had decided the Unbroken did not. They had decided wrong twice. She wondered how many more times they had been wrong, and how soon they were going to have to answer for it. 5 years after the Orith, humanity had 9 ships, not 9 of the same ship. 9 different ships, because humans did not build the same thing twice when they could build something better instead. And every ship after the first Unbroken had been improved. Better drive efficiency, better hull alloys, better life support, better targeting and navigation. The shipyard in the steppe had grown to 3 times its original size, and there were 2 more yards now. One off the coast of South Africa, and one in orbit. The orbital yard being the thing that Yusuf had pushed for hardest and gotten approved fastest, because once you could get to orbit cheaply, the idea of building in orbit was almost obvious. The Orith had been careful and slow and curious in the way that very old civilizations are curious, like scholars handling a document they are not sure is authentic. They had sent a diplomatic vessel to Earth's system 14 months after the first contact, and the visit had been formal and measured, and had produced a framework for communication that both sides agreed was a beginning and not an end. They had also, without being asked, told humanity something important. They had told them where Veth space was, not as a gift, not out of generosity. The Orith had told them the way you tell a neighbor that the large dog 3 doors down is not friendly. Because the information was relevant and withholding it served no one. The Veth's territory was vast, the Orith said. It covered more systems than humanity had yet visited. The edge of Veth administrative space was close, closer than humanity had guessed, barely 60 light-years from Earth. And the Veth had, as far as the Orith knew, still not updated their records to reflect that anything interesting lived on the 3rd planet of their old dumping ground. Chen had sat with that for a long time. Then she had brought it to the commission, which had spent 8 months arguing about it. And then she had done what she had been doing for 15 years when the arguments produced no action. She moved anyway. The delegation consisted of 3 ships. The Unbroken, the first one, the one they had built from the blueprint of a discarded alien vessel, 11 years old now, and still the most tested hull in the fleet. The Meridian, the second ship ever built, steadier and more powerful than its predecessor. And a new vessel, 3 years old, named the Breadwinner, in a vote that had produced that result, to basically everyone's surprise. But the crew had chosen it, and the crew had earned the right. Torres commanded the Unbroken now. He had held the role for 4 years, having moved from operations to command the way water moves to low ground. Not dramatically, just inevitably, following the path of least resistance toward the place it was always going. He was not the kind of commander who made speeches. He ran a ship the way Yusuf ran an engine room, quietly, completely, with total attention and no wasted motion. Chen was aboard as the delegation's head. Morova was with her. Okafor had stayed on Earth. He had a lab now, 400 people working under him, and leaving it felt to him like leaving a second body behind. He had argued against the trip. He had lost the argument and spent the weeks before departure being loudly unhappy about it in a way that meant he was worried, which was how Okafor showed he cared about things. Yusuf had said goodbye at the orbital yard, standing on the dock platform while the Unbroken was being run through final checks, and his goodbye had been one sentence. "Come back with something worth knowing," he said. She had promised she would. They jumped to the edge of Veth space, not into it. To the edge, a system on the boundary of the Orath's mapped territory, empty of habitation, chosen because it gave them a position from which they could observe Veth traffic patterns before announcing themselves. This had been Chen's insistence, and the 6 governments most invested in the mission had agreed, which told Chen the 6 governments were more nervous than they were admitting. They spent 2 weeks watching. Veth ships moved through the region in patterns that were, Mirova noted, extraordinarily regular. The same routes, the same intervals, the same configurations. Not patrols, nothing that implied alertness or anticipation, administrative traffic, cargo runs and bureaucratic transports moving on schedules that had probably not been changed in decades. Torres watched the traffic patterns for 2 weeks and said, on the 15th day, that they moved like buses. Buses? No variation, no awareness. He paused. They're not watching the edges. They don't expect anything to come from outside their routes. Because nothing does, Mirova said. The Orath move around them, not through. Most species do. The Veth are large enough that you simply route around them. Torres looked at the traffic patterns on his display. That's going to be a problem for them, he said. They entered Veth space on the 16th day. Chen sent the broadcast ahead of them. A formal contact package using the Veth script, which Mirova could now write as well as any human wrote a second language, carrying a mathematical introduction and a statement of identity and a request for communication. Correct and careful, built to be impossible to misread. It took the Veth 4 hours to respond. The response when it came was not from a ship. It was from an administrative relay station, 3 light hours inside their border, an automated system, by the look of it, routing the signal through a bureaucratic chain that Mirova mapped in real time as the messages passed through it. The reply that came back was the kind of reply that an administrative system sends when something has landed in the wrong category, and it is not sure what to do with it. It was in essence a form letter. Please identify your administrative affiliation. Please provide vessel registration. Please specify your cargo classification and destination system. If you are in distress, proceed to the nearest Veth maintenance station at these coordinates. Chen read it. She read it again. Then she handed it to Mirova and said, reply. Tell them we don't have an administrative affiliation in their system. Tell them this is first contact and we are requesting communication with whoever handles that. Mirova translated and sent. 4 more hours passed. The reply was another form letter, similar language, slightly different routing, a different bureaucratic chain, but the same essential message. The system did not have a category for what the humans were, and therefore was redirecting them toward the nearest applicable category, which was not applicable at all. Torres stood at his station with his arms crossed and said nothing. They have a process for everything, Mirova said, and no process for this. So the system keeps trying to fit us into an existing box. How long does that go on? Chen asked. Until it escalates to something that can think. It took 11 hours and 4 more form letters before that happened. The ship that came was large. Not a warship. The configuration was administrative. The same kind of bureaucratic presence that the Orath had described. The kind of ship the Veth used to manage their territory the way a city uses civil servants. But it was large, and it moved with the particular confidence of something that had never had a reason not to be confident. And when it dropped out of transit at close range and held position 200 kilometers off the Unbroken's bow, Chen felt the crew go still. Not afraid, still. Alert, good. The communication that came from the administrative ship was direct. Mirova had it translated within minutes. The message said, you are in Veth space without authorization. Please identify and provide administrative registration. Chen dictated the reply herself, with Mirova handling the translation. It said, we are from the 3rd planet of the system you use for disposal. We have no registration in your system because until 17 years ago, we did not know your system existed. We know it now. We are here to introduce ourselves. The Veth ship took 22 minutes to reply. In the normal rhythm of the exchange, that was very long. The reply said, the 3rd planet of the Unfor system is classified as uninhabited. Category 4 subsapient biosphere, no administrative significance. Chen read that 3 times. Subsapient. She sat with the word for a moment. She let it be what it was. Then she filed it in the same place she had filed everything else over the last 15 years. That had tried to tell her that what she was doing was not worth doing. The reply she sent said, your classification is incorrect. We would like the opportunity to demonstrate that. Another long pause. Then, the Veth ship asked a question that the automated systems had not been capable of asking. It asked, "How did you get a functioning interstellar drive?" And Chen, for the first time in the entire exchange, smiled. She told them exactly how. She did not soften it. She did not present it diplomatically or cushion it in careful language. Mirova had offered to rephrase, and Chen had said no, because the truth of it was the point. She said, 18 years ago, a Veth vessel was classified as failed and discarded into the Yun-4 system. It landed on the third planet. We recovered it, we studied it, we rebuilt it. We built more ships from what we learned. We are here in one of those ships now, she said. We found the crew still aboard. We know what the ship was called and who named it and why. She said, your people decided the Unbroken had no more weight. We disagreed. The Veth ship's response took 41 minutes. When it came, it was not a single message but a cascade of bureaucratic transmissions, signals going out in multiple directions, up administrative chains, flagging systems, routing status changes. The humans could see the signal spreading from the ship like ripples in still water. The machinery of a vast old civilization beginning to turn its attention toward a thing it had not expected to exist. Torres watched it happen on the communication display. He said, they're reporting us up the chain. Good, Chen said. They're not going to like what they hear from the top. Probably not. Could get difficult, he said. Chen looked at the Veth ship on the screen. Large and confident and suddenly, very slightly, uncertain. The uncertainty showed in the pattern of the outgoing signals. Too many of them, too fast, going to too many places. The behavior of a system that had encountered something it did not have a form for, and was urgently looking for one. Let me tell you something about difficult, she said. We took apart a ship we found in a hole in the ground and learned to sail it in 7 years. We flew 31 light years to say hello to people who didn't know we were coming. We got here by doing the impossible so many times we stopped calling it that. She looked at Torres. Difficult is something we know. He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth did a small thing that was almost a smile. The Veth sent a second ship 6 hours later, then a third. None of them were warships. That was important. Chen and Torres watched each arrival carefully, and every ship that came had the same administrative configuration. Bigger than the first, more senior in the hierarchy, but the same category of vessel. Not force, not threat. The Veth were escalating through their system, not their military, which meant they were confused, not hostile, which meant there was still room. The senior Veth representative established direct communication in hour 22. This was not an automated system. This was the Veth equivalent of a person, a designation, a rank, a voice behind the words. Mirova handled the translation with the care she gave everything that mattered, which was everything. The Veth representative said, the humans should not be here. Said it without anger, the same way you might say a door should not be open that you are certain you closed. It was a statement of category, a correction. Chen replied, we are here. That is the current state of things. The representative said the Yun-4 system was Veth territory, and the third planet was catalogued under Veth administrative code. Chen replied, you are welcome to update the catalog. A pause. Then the representative said something that Mirova translated twice before she was satisfied with it. The word the Veth used was not quite a question, and not quite a challenge. It was something in between, an interrogation of reality, a demand that the universe explain itself. The word meant, what are you? Chen thought about that question, about everything that had led to this moment. The crater, the dark ship, the dead workers, the manual on the platform wall, 7 years of arguments and steel, the first jump, the Orith sphere, 5 years of building and learning and going farther each time. She thought about Yusuf's hand on the activations panel, and the lights rising in the walls of a ship that had been declared dead and was not dead. She thought about the Unbroken, the one in the crater, the one she was standing in. She gave Mirova the reply and waited while Mirova found it in the Veth language. Then they sent it. It said, we are the people from the world you didn't think was worth watching. We have been watching you for 18 years. We know what you threw away and why. We know what it cost the people you left on that ship. We know how your system works and what it values and what it decides has no more weight. It said, we are here to tell you that your system made an error. It said, we are also here to tell you that we are not asking for your permission to be here. We are extending you the courtesy of an introduction. We suggest you accept it. The Veth ships held their positions. The silence stretched. Torres stood at the command station, watching the display, and said nothing. Mirova sat at her station with her hands folded and waited. Chen watched the Veth ships and felt the silence the way you feel weather. Something large and deciding, moving toward a shape it had not yet taken. She was not afraid. She had not been afraid since the day she stood in a dark alien corridor and decided to keep walking. She was not about to start now. The Veth took 3 days to respond. Not 3 days of silence. The administrative signals kept moving, spreading further into Veth space, climbing higher up the chain, reaching levels of the bureaucracy that had not received a novel input in longer than anyone on the human ships could calculate. The machinery of a civilization that had been running on maintenance mode for thousands of years was being asked, for the first time in a very long time, to make a new decision. Torres watched the signals and did not sleep much. Chen slept less. Mirova slept fine. When Chen asked her how she managed it, Mirova said she had spent her whole career sitting with things she did not yet understand, waiting for them to become clear. This was just another version of that. She said it the way she said most things, simply without decoration, as a statement of practical fact. Chen envied her that she always had. The breadwinner and the Meridian held their positions, flanking the Unbroken. Their crews ran normal operations and tried not to watch the Veth ships too closely, which was a thing you could only do for so long before you gave up and watched anyway. The Veth ships, 7 of them now, each larger and more senior than the last, held their own positions in a rough arc 200 kilometers off. Not an encirclement, not a threatening formation, just presence. The physical expression of an institution that was not sure what to do, but was certain that doing nothing was also wrong. On the 3rd day, a new ship arrived. Different configuration. Not administrative, not military, exactly, but built with the kind of deliberate weight that meant it carried authority rather than function. It was the largest vessel any of the humans had seen up close, dark and slow and certain of itself, and it positioned itself at the center of the Veth arc and held there, and then opened a communication channel directly to the Unbroken. Mirova looked at the incoming signal and was quiet for a moment. Senior diplomatic designation, she said. This isn't a bureaucrat. This is someone who was sent. Sent by whom? Torres asked. By whatever is at the top. She paused. They took 3 days because they went all the way up, and whoever is at the top decided to send someone down instead of a form letter. Chen sat up straighter. Then let's talk, she said. The Veth diplomat's name translated as something close to assessor. Not a personal name, a title, a role, a function within the system. The Veth did not appear to use personal names in official contexts. Everything was designation and classification, rank and category. Even the being speaking to them was a category before it was an individual. The assessor spoke with Mirova for 2 hours. Chen sat beside her and listened, getting Mirova's running translation in real time, keeping her face even and her responses measured. The assessor's opening position was not hostile. That was the first surprise. Chen had been prepared for many things: dismissal, threat, bureaucratic stonewalling. What she had not fully prepared for was the quality of attention the assessor brought to the conversation. It asked careful questions. It listened to the answers. It did not repeat its conclusions as though the answers hadn't been given. The Veth had known, it said, that the Yun 4 system had been used for disposal. This was unremarkable. Hundreds of systems had been used that way over the centuries. The 3rd planet's biosphere had been classified as subsapient based on assessments that were, the assessor acknowledged with no particular emotion, old. Very old. How old? Chen asked through Mirova. Older than your recorded history, the assessor said. The last survey of the Yun 4 system had been conducted 4,000 years ago. Chen absorbed that. 4,000 years ago, humanity had been building mud brick cities between 2 rivers and had no concept of the stars as destinations. The Veth had looked, seen nothing worth watching, and not looked again. She thought, 4,000 years, they checked once. She did not say that out loud. Mirova, reading her face, had the expression of someone who was very deliberately not commenting. The assessor said, the vessel that was deposited in the Yun 4 system was classified as a Category 6 disposal. Irrecoverable, core failure, structural damage beyond viable repair threshold. Chen said, the core was not failed. It was in protective shutdown. Your assessment was incorrect. A pause, the assessor said yes, just that, a straight line clean and undefended, yes. The assessment had been incorrect. It said this the way you say a fact that is uncomfortable but is still a fact, without softening it and without elaborating on it. And Chen felt something shift in the room, in the quality of the exchange, because it was honest in a way she had not expected from something that had spent 3 days generating form letters. She said, there were workers aboard, 3 of them, they were not evacuated. The pause this time was longer. The assessor said, the disposal record does not reflect crew aboard at time of classification. The record indicates the vessel was evacuated prior to disposal. The record is wrong, Chen said. Another pause. Yes, the assessor said again. It appears the record is wrong. What came next was not a negotiation in any form Chen had a word for. It was more like an accounting. The assessor asked for everything. The full record of what had been found on the ship. What had been understood, what had been built, where humanity had gone, and who they had spoken to. It asked for the manual on the platform wall. It asked for Mirova's translation of the maintenance engineer's letter. Morova provided all of it. Every document, every translation, every record of the team's work going back 18 years. She transmitted it with the same care she gave everything. The assessor received the data and was quiet for a long time. Then it said, the individual who wrote the manual, their designation in our records. Morova pulled the designation, the inventory code that had been on the dead worker's suit sleeve, the same code that appeared in the ship's records beside the manual. She sent it. The assessor ran it through its system. The humans could see the query going out, reaching into Veth records, pulling something back. When the assessor spoke again, the quality of its voice, its transmission, its tone had changed. Not by much. But Morova noticed, and Chen noticed, and Torres, standing at the back of the room, noticed because Torres noticed everything. The assessor said, this individual was recorded as evacuated with the rest of the crew. Their record was closed as such. Under our system, a closed record cannot be reopened without cause. Chen said, their remains are still on the ship. In the Yun 4 system, that is cause. Another long pause, the longest yet. The assessor said, yes, that is cause. It said, we will need to send a vessel. Chen said, we will take you there ourselves. The journey back to Earth's system was not quick. The Veth assessor's ship was not built for speed in the way the human vessels were. It was built for permanence, for the slow, confident movement of an institution. And it traveled at its own pace, and the humans adjusted to that pace, because they had just accomplished something real and they could afford patience. Torres used the travel time well. He sat with Morova every day, and worked on his Veth vocabulary, which was not good and would not be good for years, but which was something. Morova taught him the way she taught everything, by starting with structure, not vocabulary, so that the words would have somewhere to go when they came. Chen spent the travel time writing the report she had been composing in her head for 3 days, since the moment the assessor said yes for the first time. Not a commission report. Those would come later, long and formal and argued over by people who had not been in the room. This was something else. The record of what had happened. From the beginning, from the Tuesday when a ship fell out of a clear sky to this. A human vessel leading a Veth diplomat toward a crater in the Kazakhstan steppe. She wrote it the way Morova had taught her to think about the manual, pedagogically, so that the structure itself taught you something as you moved through it, so that the person reading it at the end would understand more than the person who started it. She wrote about the maintenance engineer last. She wrote about the letter and what it meant to find it, what it meant that someone had done that, had sat on a condemned ship and written instructions for a finder they would never meet, in a language designed to be decoded, on the wall where it could not be missed. She wrote, that person believed someone would come. They believed it enough to spend their last day time, making sure that someone would know what to do when they got there. They never knew if they were right. She wrote, they were right. The crater looked different with a Veth ship orbiting overhead. Chen stood at the edge of it in the cold Kazakh wind, and looked at the unbroken sitting in the black scorched earth where it had been for 19 years. It had been maintained, studied, preserved, kept clean of weather damage by a team that had been here continuously since the 2nd year. It still had all its missing hull sections. It still had the mismatched welds. It still looked, fundamentally, like something that had been thrown away. The Veth landing team came down in a small transport, 4 of them, with equipment and the assessor at their lead. They walked to the ship in the same silence the human team had walked to it 19 years ago, and Chen watched them from the crater's edge and felt the strange specific feeling of a thing coming full circle, not ending but closing, the way a door closes, solidly, on a space that will still be there on the other side. The assessor stopped at the entry point. It stood there for a moment. Then it turned and looked at Chen, across the distance between them, and transmitted a single phrase through the translation system. Morova said, it says this ship has weight. Chen looked at the unbroken. 19 years of weather and study had not changed it. It was exactly what it had always been. A broken thing that someone had decided had no value, sitting in a hole, waiting for someone to disagree. She said yes, it always did. The Veth recovered their workers with the full ceremony their culture applied to such things, which turned out to be significant, more elaborate and more serious than any human who had not read Morova's later translations would have guessed. The Veth, for all their bureaucratic coldness, had a complicated relationship with their dead. They did not leave them in wrong records. They did not leave them in wrong places, once they knew. The 3 workers were taken home. The maintenance engineer was the last. Before the remains were moved, Morova asked the assessor for the individual's personal name, not the designation, the name, the one the crew would have used. The assessor accessed the record that had been reopened and provided it. The name translated approximately as Ren. Morova wrote it down. She added it to the translation of the manual, on the cover page, above the title, where it should have been from the beginning. The Manual of the Unbroken by Ren. Chen stood in the ship's central chamber one last time, while the Veth finished their work in the side room. The blue light still ran through the walls. The display surfaces still showed data in a language she could now read, almost with effort. The platform at the center of the room was still covered in the marks that Mirova had spent 2 months learning to decode, that had taught her the language as she went, that had been written by someone who believed in the value of the thing they were leaving behind. She put her hand flat on the surface of the platform. The metal was cool and smooth, and it absorbed her warmth the same way it absorbed everything, completely, without giving it back. She stayed there for a moment, then she went out. The agreement with the Veth took 14 more months to reach, and was not simple, and was not painless, and required arguments that Chen would not describe as pleasant, even in the mildest possible framing. The Veth system did not change quickly. It had not been built to change quickly. It had been built to persist, and it would persist long after everyone involved in this negotiation was gone. But it changed. The Yunfor system was reclassified. The third planet's entry was updated. The category that had said subsapient was replaced with a designation that Mirova translated as independent sapient emergence, a category that had not existed in the Veth system before, and had to be created for this specific case, and then, because the Veth system was thorough if nothing else, applied retroactively to check if any other worlds had been similarly misclassified. They found 6. 3 of them had developed nothing further. 2 of them had complex ecosystems that warranted new surveys. One of them had, in the intervening centuries since the last assessment, developed something that looked a great deal like civilization. The Veth were going to be busy for a while. The Orith, when Chen told them, laughed, not in their full language, just a sound, a response that was distinctly not formal and distinctly amused, that came through the communication system and sat in the air of the unbroken central chamber for a moment. Chen laughed too. The 9th ship in the human fleet was renamed. It had been called the Resolution, which was a fine name and had been voted on properly, and nobody objected to the renaming except on procedural grounds, which Chen had been overruling on procedural grounds for 20 years, and was not about to stop. The 9th ship became the Ren. It was painted with the inventory code from the maintenance engineer's suit sleeve, not as decoration but as identification. The way a name goes on a ship, the way you carry something forward. At the commissioning ceremony, which was held at the orbital yard with every commission member present, and several Orith observers, and one very senior Veth administrative representative, who had come without being asked and stood at the back without speaking, Chen gave the shortest speech of her career. She said, 18 years ago, someone left a road for us. They didn't know who would find it. They didn't know if anyone would. They left it anyway, because they believed the ship had weight, and they were not going to let it go down without saying so. She said, every ship we build is an answer to that belief. Every star we reach is proof that they were right. She said, we didn't ask anyone's permission to come this far. We're not going to ask for the next part either. She looked at the ship, at the inventory code on its hull painted there in the same dark color as the original. The code that was now also a name, also a dedication, also a small permanent argument against the idea that the ones who decide weight are always right. She said, we go now. They went.